was nothing short of a miracle when the boxes containing the estate of Bauhaus photographer Lucia Moholy, who died in 1989, were unpacked 3 years later. They contained the majority of her Bauhaus negatives, which had been thought lost. Among a total of 1,000 negatives, we found more than 200 glass negatives, the core of her architectural and object photographs from 1920s, which still characterize our visual memory of the Bauhaus today. But how did her estate end up in the Bauhaus-Archiv, and what was her story of the missing negatives all about? The Moholy estate is a stroke of luck. Ideally, artists ensure during their lifetime that their work or parts of it are preserved. This is what the founder of the Bauhaus-Archiv, Hans M. Wingler, and Bauhaus founder Walter Gropius agreed. As a result, the Bauhaus-Archiv, founded in 1961, was able to suggest that living Bauhaus members and their heirs do the same as Gropius and donate their works to the archive. In 1965, Lucia Moholy also offered the Bauhaus-Archiv her Bauhaus negatives, which Gropius had returned to her only a few years earlier, but she withdrew this offer shortly before the purchase agreement was reached. After her death, however, her estate administrator, the British lawyer Friedrich Carsten, honored the wish of the Bauhaus-Archiv to take over the estate. He was supported by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's daughter Hatula and by Moholy expert Rolf Sachse. It is thanks to their cooperation and the help of the Swiss lawyer Vital Hauser that Lucia Moholy's photographic and documentary estate came to the Bauhaus-Archiv in Berlin in 1992. Now, two estates complement each other in the most meaningful way. Gropius' photographic archive and Lucia Moholy's archive, as well as the extensive correspondence of these two personalities who shaped the Bauhaus. Second one. Gropius' photo archive and his correspondence, including the letters with Lucia Moholy, were digitized with funding from the European Union. Both are accessible online at openarchivebauhaus.de. The correspondence between Moholy and Gropius reads like a crime story. After an initially friendly exchange, the correspondence culminated in a lawyer's order obtained by Moholy for the return of her negatives in 1957. Gropius had, it seems, never told her that he had them. This dispute ended both the correspondence and the long friendship. All of this can be read not only in the letters themselves, but also in thoroughly researched essays by Robin Schuldenfrei. However, the story was not quite complete. I would therefore like to point out a circumstance that should be added to this story. It concerns Moholy's contradictory statements about the number of negatives returned by Gropius. Immediately after receiving over 200 negatives, she claimed that only 100 of them were actually her own photographs. A few years later, however, there were 200 negatives which she offered the Bauhaus-Archiv. And almost 20 years later, at the age of 89, she complained in the essay The Missing Negatives, which is still quoted today, that she had only received 50 of her negatives from Gropius. But instead, we found more than 200 of her Bauhaus negatives in her estate. To clarify matters, I contacted people who had looked after her in the last years of her life. In 1995, Johannes Itten's widow, Anneliese, told me the following story. She once helped Lucia to bring boxes from the cellar of her Zurich flat upstairs for inspection. She remembered having to carry many boxes one by one because they were very heavy. When opened, what they revealed was her glass negatives. Mrs. Itten told me that that she still remembers Lucia Moholy's reaction when she saw the negatives. "Well, there they are, all of them. I've done Gropius wrong." She had simply forgotten about them. As you can see, things are not always black and white. But the important point is that Lucia Moholy had no access to her negatives during her exile until 1957. If she had had them, her sometimes difficult financial situation might have been improved. Gropius photo archive contains around 200 vintage prints by Lucia Moholy. These can now be compared with the negatives from her estate. As we know, negatives provide information about a photographer's working methods. So here too, the question arose, have section been marked? Were the negatives themselves edited? Neither was necessarily to be expected, but there were surprises. On the left, you can see the original print of this famous photograph of the corner of the studio building. We had always assumed that it was a portrait format, but the image on the right shows the entire 18 by 24 centimeter format, a landscape format, almost half of which has been taped over. However, this example is rather untypical of Moholy's working method. She nearly always used the entire negative by simply choosing the right angle for her shots. On the, Moment, was habe ich hier? Das hier. Another fine example for the photographer's working method is one of the most widely publicized photos of the Bauhaus building, the southwest view with the famous vertical lettering Bauhaus from the Gropius estate. And on the right, the negative from the photographer's estate. We know that Lucia Moholy made contact prints from her 18 by 24 centimeter glass negatives instead of enlargements. An enlarger for such large negatives is huge and unwieldy. A dark and small room was sufficient for contact prints, but the exposure process required a lot of experience to achieve the desired chiaroscuro. So the photographer helped herself by dimming very bright areas in the negative with a red ink called neukoxene in order to achieve a better balance during the exposure. Here's my favorite example of image processing. When we look at the photo of the studio window in the Moholy Notch Master's house for a while, we tend to focus on the striking black window in the center of the picture. Its dominant black color contrasts with the white of the wall, creating a beautiful graphic effect. To achieve this type of effect, prints can either be exposed for longer or they can be retouched. However, in this case, the photographer dared to take a radical step. She processed the glass negative by making an irreversible change. She scratched away the entire emerging gelatin layer from the window part in the negative. This allowed the light to hit the photographic paper directly in this part of the print and thus achieve the extremely black effect. As you can imagine, discoveries like this are great moments in an archive, because until then, no one but the photographer knew the secret of what she had done. However, it was no secret which camera she used at the Bauhaus. Here you can see her field camera, which she used to take all the Bauhaus photographs in large formats. The Bauhaus-Archiv is in a fortunate position of having this and later cameras in its possession, as well as the photographer's equipment. On the left is a rare photo, indeed the only one known to me, showing Lucia Moholy at work with her large camera. It shows her setting up her tripod. The camera is still folded up in the backpack to the left behind her. It is the moment shortly before the group photo of the Bauhaus masters, which you can see on the right. In contrast to another famous but rather stiff photo of the Bauhaus masters, this photo is much more relaxed and shows the special team spirit between Gropius and the Bauhaus masters. Nevertheless, Gropius rarely used it. Here we see the roof garden of the studio building, where the group photo and many hundreds of Bauhaus snapshots were taken. With a twinkle in her eye, the photographer allowed her shadow to be seen as a hidden self-portrait at the front right. So much, or rather so little, about Lucia Moholy's photographs. I was also asked to say something about her scientific and literary legacy, which is also stored at the Bauhaus-Archiv. However, due to its volume, this would require a separate presentation. I would like to pick out just one example. The most successful of Lucia Moholy's literary work is her publication, 100 Years of Photography, which she wrote as a commissioned work during her English exile. The book was published in 1939 by the British publishing house Penguin. It was a large edition of 40,000 copies in a handy pocket format, and it was quickly sold out. Unfortunately, it was not reprinted, probably due to the war. What makes the book interesting to this day is the author's perspective. She did not write the umpteenth technical or artistic history of photography, but its cultural history, focusing on the interrelationship between photography and society. To our surprise, all the author's photographic material for this book was found in her estate. The Bauhaus-Archiv was therefore able to republish the book together with the German translation. Lucia Moholy would certainly have been delighted to know that it is now also being published in a Czech translation here in her native city. Lucia Moholy herself commissioned her portrait photo inside the book from the photographer Howard Costa, one of the most important British portraitists of the time. This carefully illuminated portrait shows her as a thoughtful, attentive, highly focused author and sensitive observer. Let me conclude with two late portrait photos chosen from the many photographs that Lucia Moholy kept, not without pride, as they were visible proof of her growing recognition by the younger generation. I like this portrait photo by Hans-Peter Klauser. It shows Lucia Moholy, aged over 80, looking in the book in a seemingly private moment. But her close examination of every Bauhaus publication also shows how she never overlooked a mistake. She often had to complain about missing information regarding her authorship, not to mention her annoyance about expired copyrights. I therefore see her also as a pioneer of the change in European copyright law, which only put photographers on an equal footing with other artists in 1999, 10 years after her death. This picture by Michael van Graffenried shows the 93-year-old photographer in front of her Bauhaus library, holding a large photograph of one of her famous Bauhaus motifs that we saw earlier. She cheerfully and proudly presents a format that she could not easily have created during the Bauhaus period. After she received her negatives finally from Gropius, she was able to experiment with larger formats, supported by Zurich photographers Giorgio Hoch and Hans-Peter Klauser. But the real question we were facing in view of her negative archive was, how do we make 1,000 negatives visible, some of which have probably never been enlarged? Nowadays, we would start by scanning the negatives. In 1992, we didn't have this option, and so we gradually had new prints made of all the negatives. These archive-proof modern prints produced by Berlin photographers Knut Petersen and Markus Havlik are stored in the Bauhaus-Archiv's collection in the same way as vintage prints. Nevertheless, digitization must continue because, as the saying goes, what is not in the internet does not exist. Yeah, thank you very much. Velmi vám děkuji.